They were America's elite, combat-tested, battle-scarred men who'd watched brothers fall and walked out of hell with blood still drying on their boots. And when they were told to stand alongside Britain's ceremonial royal guards, the ones in scarlet coats and bearskin hats, they didn't laugh. They got angry. "This isn't duty," one of them muttered. "They're actors. We're soldiers." And for a while, no one disagreed until one guard moved, spoke, and in just a few quiet words, he changed the entire courtyard. Before we show you what he said that stopped even the seals in their tracks, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, Crown Guard, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The September light hit Buckingham Palace like honey poured over stone. 4:30 in the afternoon, in that particular golden hour when London shows off. When even the pigeons look dignified and the tourists stop complaining about the weather long enough to actually see where they are. The forecourt buzzed with that special energy you only get at famous places. American voices mixed with German laughter while a group of Italian teenagers tried to get the perfect group selfie. Somewhere near the Victoria Memorial, a busker played violin, something classical that drifted through conversations about dinner plans and tube routes home. Children pressed against the rope barriers with sticky fingers and wide eyes. Parents juggled cameras and ice cream cones while grandparents adjusted their spectacles for better views. The usual Sunday crowd, all doing that thing tourists do, where they pretend they're not tourists while taking photos of everything. Standing perfectly still at the southwest ceremonial post, Corporal Edward Raine had become part of the scenery. Scarlet tunic pressed to perfection, bearskin cap towering 7 inches above his head, SA-80 rifle gripped at the precise diagonal angle that took months to master. To everyone snapping photos, he was just another piece of British tradition like Big Ben or those red buses that tourists always seemed surprised still ran. But what those visitors taking selfies didn't know about the man standing so motionless in that uniform was that Edward Raine, 34 years old, had spent 3 tours with the Coldstream Guards in Helmand Province. 2 of those years had been spent manning checkpoint overwatch positions where moving at the wrong moment could compromise not just your position but the lives of every soldier in the convoy below. He'd held observation posts for 16-hour shifts while Taliban fighters moved through the valleys, learning that sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was absolutely nothing. Discipline wasn't about following orders, it was about staying alive long enough to protect the men depending on your eyes. The stillness that kept him motionless for hours at Buckingham Palace wasn't just ceremonial training. It was forged in places where shifting your weight at the wrong second could get people killed. To the crowd posing beside him, though, he was just part of the tourist experience. A living statue in a funny hat who probably couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. That assumption was about to be tested because standing near the rope line, 6 men had positioned themselves with the kind of casual precision that anyone with military experience would recognize immediately. They weren't taking photos, weren't laughing at their own jokes like the families around them, weren't checking maps or guidebooks or debating which pub to hit next. They were just watching and assessing, clearly not impressed with what they were seeing. They'd arrived 20 minutes earlier in 2 black cabs, fresh from a briefing at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. The meeting had been routine, final logistics for next week's joint training exercise with British Special Forces, diplomat courtesy kind of coordination that happened between allied nations. But the briefing had run long, and their flight back to Virginia Beach wasn't until tomorrow morning. So they'd done what tourists do in London. They'd gone to see the sights. What they hadn't expected was to feel personally insulted by what they found. Master Chief Mason Dwyer stood at the center of the group, built like a linebacker in civilian clothes, hoodie and tactical cargo pants that screamed military, even when he wasn't trying to. At 39 years old, with the kind of square jaw and buzzed hair that made TSA agents automatically assume he was law enforcement, the scars on his knuckles and the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings told a different story. This was someone who'd seen the worst the world had to offer and lived to complain about it. What the tourists pressing up against the barriers didn't know was that Mason Dwyer had just spent 18 months in Syria running counter-terrorism operations that would never make the evening news. The kind of missions where success was measured by how many American soldiers came home in one piece. And failure meant explaining to wives and mothers why their loved ones weren't coming home at all. He'd pulled wounded SEALs out of collapsed buildings while mortar rounds were still falling. He had spent 72 hours straight clearing compounds full of improvised explosives and hostile fighters who'd rather die than surrender. The kind of high-stakes life-or-death warfare that forged operators into something harder than steel. And now he was standing in front of Buckingham Palace, watching a man in a red costume stand perfectly still while tourists took selfies. To Dwyer, it felt like a joke. A very expensive, very British joke. "They call this duty," he muttered to the SEAL beside him, his voice carrying just enough edge to make nearby tourists glance over. Reagan Hale, early 30s with an Alabama drawl that never quite faded despite years of international deployments, snorted quietly. "Look at him. We've pulled kids from burning buildings in Fallujah, and this guy flinches if someone sneezes too loud." The comment wasn't meant to be private. It carried across the rope line, deliberate and pointed. A few tourists shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the conversation happening next to them wasn't about sightseeing or afternoon plans. Near the front of the crowd, a little girl clutching a Union Jack pinwheel looked up at her mother with confused eyes. "Mommy, why are those men being mean about the guard?" Her mother glanced nervously between the SEALs and the motionless figure in red. "They're just having different opinions, love. Nothing to worry about." But there was something to worry about. The tension was building like pressure in a pipe, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't quite identify what was happening. Torres, the tallest of the group, rolled his eyes toward a nearby family of German tourists who were explaining the history of the Queen's Guard to their teenagers. "Yeah, deployed to photo ops," he said loud enough for them to hear. "Real dangerous work standing still for tourists." Franklin, thick-necked with arms crossed, added his own assessment. "We earn our medals in blood. These guys get theirs for keeping their socks pulled up during inspection." The words hit the crowd like cold water. Conversations faltered. Camera phones lowered slightly. Parents instinctively moved their children a step back from the rope line, sensing that something was shifting from tourist entertainment to something else entirely. From his position near the North Gate, Palace Security Supervisor James Morrison felt his radio crackle to life. "Control to Morrison. We've got elevated voices at the Southwest Ceremonial Post. American accents, possible military. Recommend observation." Morrison keyed his radio quietly. "Copy that. Moving to assess." 23 years in royal protection had taught him to recognize the difference between drunk tourists making noise and actual problems developing. This felt like the latter. But through it all, Edward Raine hadn't moved so much as a muscle. His breathing remained steady. His grip on the SA-80 stayed perfectly positioned. His eyes continued staring straight ahead at that infinite middle distance that guards are trained to focus on. He'd heard every word. The angle of his jaw made that clear to anyone paying attention. But he remained locked in that perfect ceremonial stillness that took years to master. And somehow that complete lack of reaction seemed to irritate the SEALs even more. What they didn't understand, what civilians never understood, was that Raine wasn't ignoring them out of weakness. In Helmand, he'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was give your enemy the reaction they wanted. Insurgents would provoke British forces, hoping for an overreaction that would turn local opinion against them. This felt exactly the same, and Raine had been through too much to take that bait. Dwyer stepped closer to the rope barrier, his voice dropping to that particular tone that experienced soldiers use when they want to be heard without technically causing a scene. "He hasn't moved once, not even to blink." "You think he's even listening?" Hale wondered aloud. "Oh, he's listening," Dwyer replied, his eyes never leaving Raine's motionless form. "They're trained for that, just not trained for anything else useful." A middle-aged woman in a Scotland rugby jersey shifted uncomfortably and began steering her husband away from the developing confrontation. An elderly gentleman with a Royal Navy veteran's cap studied the scene with different eyes, the kind that recognized brewing trouble when they saw it. From across the forecourt, a Metropolitan Police officer noticed the shift in crowd dynamics and started moving casually closer. His radio clipped to his vest, but not yet in his hand. "They're ornaments," Dwyer said suddenly, his voice rising just enough to carry across the entire rope line area. "That's what this is. Ceremony, pageantry, wax figures with rifles they probably don't even know how to use." The words landed like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd turned completely around to stare. A woman instinctively stepped between her toddler and the rope barrier. Another tourist raised her phone to record, then thought better of it and lowered it again. This was no longer a conversation between soldiers. It had become a public challenge. From his position 30 yards away, Security Supervisor Morrison spoke quietly into his radio. "Control, this is Morrison. American military personnel appears to be deliberately provoking Ceremonial Guard, requesting guidance on intervention protocol." The response came immediately. "Morrison, monitor closely. Do not intervene unless physical contact occurs. Let's see how our guard handles this." In the control room beneath the East Wing, duty officers were already pulling up security footage from multiple angles. This wasn't the first time foreign military personnel had tested their guards, but it was the first time it had been this public, this deliberate. "We're supposed to stand next to them like equals," Dwyer continued, his disgust now unmistakable, "like we're all in the same business. But they're not soldiers, they're actors, performers in a show for people who want to believe in fairy tales." Near the edge of the crowd, a man in a parachute regiment veteran's cap had been listening with growing anger. At 73, Derek Collins had served 2 tours in Northern Ireland and remembered when being a soldier meant something more than ceremony. He'd kept quiet until now, but this American's disrespect was too much. "Excuse me, mate," Collins called out, his Yorkshire accent cutting through the tension. "That actor you're slagging off has done more tours than you've had hot dinners." Dwyer turned, surprised to find himself challenged by a civilian. "That's so, Grandpa," Hale interjected before Dwyer could respond. "What would you know about real soldiering?" Collins stepped closer, his walking stick tapping the pavement. "I know enough to recognize it when I see it, and I know enough to spot Yanks who think they invented warfare." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some tourists backed away, others leaned in, phones ready. Morrison keyed his radio. "Control, we have civilian involvement. Elderly veteran engaging with Americans. Continue monitoring." Collins wasn't finished. "You want to know what that lad has done?" He pointed at the guard. "He stood over coffins of better men than you'll ever be. He carried his own brother home in a flag-draped box." "How would you know?" Franklin challenged. "Because I was at the funeral," Collins snapped. "Lieutenant Thomas Raine, killed in Afghanistan. That guard carried his brother's coffin down the aisle where Tommy was supposed to walk for his wedding." The crowd fell silent. Even the busker stopped playing. Morrison whispered into his radio again. "Veteran knows personal info, situation escalating." And still Corporal Edward Raine stood motionless. Not because duty required it, but because silence can be strength. Yet every man has his limits. Then a voice cut through the tension. Calm, controlled. British. "You've confused stillness with weakness." Every head turned. The Royal Guard had spoken. "You've confused discipline with surrender. That's your misunderstanding, not mine," Raine said. His rifle never moved, but his words carried centuries of tradition. "I haven't cleared compounds or held dying men," Raine admitted. "But I've stood guard over coffins. I've presented flags to widows. I've endured mothers' silence at funerals. And I've done it without flinching, because that's what the moment demanded." The crowd was riveted. Dwyer, the Navy SEAL, shifted his stance. The mockery was gone. "So, Afghanistan took your brother. I respect that. But standing here like a statue, how does that honor his sacrifice? You think standing motionless is easy?" Raine asked. His words now for the crowd. Try 6 hours in August heat while protesters scream in your face. Try holding position when you've just learned your best mate was killed in Helmand. Try ignoring every drunk tourist who thinks making you flinch proves something. Collins barked, "Tell him, lad." Dwyer pressed again. "Discipline is one thing, but what's the point of it? We use ours to save lives. You stand still for selfies." Raine's mask cracked, his voice harder. "We endure grief. Watching your parents age a decade when the casualty team knocks. Standing over graves every Remembrance Day, knowing it could have been yours." The crowd understood now. A young mother wiped tears from her eyes. Raine turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Dwyer. "You train for chaos. We train for restraint." 3 seconds of eye contact said everything. "Don't mistake silence for surrender," Raine concluded. The silence was sacred. An elderly veteran removed his cap. Teenagers lowered their phones. Respect replaced mockery. Then Dwyer spoke again, voice stripped of contempt. "I lost 3 men in Aleppo. I carried one of them to the helicopter with his blood on me. Wrote letters to their mothers. Sat with Marines who'll never walk again. That fire doesn't burn slow. It consumes everything." Raine listened, no judgment, just recognition. "But you know what broke me?" Dwyer said quietly. "Standing at Tommy Rodriguez's funeral, trying not to collapse when his mother thanked me for bringing him home. That's when I learned what standing still costs." Raine nodded. "I carried my brother's coffin. He was 26, engaged, supposed to be married that autumn. Instead, I stood guard at his memorial, 4 hours without moving. Someone had to." The crowd held its breath. A businessman removed his hat. A little girl saluted. Even teenagers stared with newfound respect. "Different battles," Dwyer said at last. "Same war," Raine replied. Collins stepped forward. "About bloody time. Both of you lost men. Both of you kept going. That's what matters." Others in the crowd joined. Nurses, businessmen, families, sharing their own stories of silent battles carried home. The SEALs withdrew. No wisecracks, no mockery, just quiet acknowledgement. Raine returned to stillness, posture perfect. But something had changed, not his bearing, his silence. It now spoke louder than any words. As the sun dipped over Buckingham Palace, one truth lingered. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands ready. And when it speaks, even once, the world never forgets.